But I thought that was a really important clip that shows a parent perspective of not only the challenges they were experiencing with their child, but the bigger challenges were the comments being made to them by professionals who probably intended to be helpful. Later in that clip, it's quite long, so I only show part of it, but I can actually send the whole clip to you that you can watch it, where the mom does meet with a psychiatrist. And one of the things the psychiatrist says to her is, "Have you heard of refrigerator mothers?" And that was the rationale given to her for why her child was behaving as he did. And then, great thing though, is later on that same psychiatrist comes on to the video clip and admits how inexperienced she was and how damaging that was and how much she learned from working with that family and other families. So I think it's actually very powerful and provides a really great perspective to working with families who are going through these struggles, and how what somebody says can really, really make a difference, either in a positive way or a negative way. The school principal admitted that the school had done and said some things wrong and turned things around, which were much more supportive for the family. So we left with you identifying where you were on those stages of compassion fatigue, and I just wanted to touch on some of the symptoms. So again, these aren't in any order of importance, but there's physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. So physical can vary, but things like obviously lack of energy, exhaustion can be physical and emotional, not sleeping well, and that's fairly ironic because here you are exhausted, yet you still can't sleep, probably because you're having thoughts about, what am I going to do? This is so terrible. I'm incompetent. I'm not good enough. Judging and blaming yourself, etc. I often get stomach issues. My stomach starts to get into a lot of pain. And we'll talk later about when you're learning to cope with that is when you're recognizing these symptoms and you're open to them and you deal with them, you actually experience much less of these symptoms. So emotional, the whole range, feeling emotionally depleted and exhausted, which can look like a lot of things. In some people, it can be sad and hopeless and helpless and sluggish. And in others, it's irritable and angry. And you can have both. And then those feelings and thoughts about yourself. So something we'll maybe spend a little bit of time talking about, but I want you to think about is that thoughts are just thoughts. They are not facts. And it's something I teach in mindfulness and mindful self-compassion is you may think, I'm a terrible parent, but that is not a fact. So we have these thoughts. And behavioral, so we often start off with that over-engagement, overzealousness, and then it can flip right to task avoidance. So I am not even buying baby food now. Maybe he can crawl around and find some of the dog food. Well, that's going to extreme. That's the second child, I think, where that happens. But you just don't involve, you don't engage, you don't show up at the school. And so if professionals are judging, oh, there's this parent that never shows up, maybe they should have been there 5 years ago when that parent always showed up and nothing happened that was helpful. Then they give up, they disengage. That's what happens to dogs. When you shock them over and over and over again, they can't escape the cage. They just stay in that cage. They don't even try to escape, but they don't do anything else either. So that's what happens. So maybe just jotting down to yourself, do you recognize any of those symptoms in yourself? And they're personal. So like I said, I get the stomach ache. You may get headaches. I may feel really sad or I may feel really angry. How do you experience it emotionally? What thoughts have you had about yourself, your child, and others? And what kinds of things do you do? Okay, so we're going to move on to the good news now. Just have a breath. Actually, it can't be too deep because of the COVID, but breathe shallowly and yet deeply. Okay, so the really good news is not all parents develop stress disorders and compassion fatigue. Now, the majority of parents who have kids with special needs do have some of these symptoms and go through some of these stages, but many of them, especially those who seek to change things or seek support, are able to rebound. So we're going to move into looking at caregiver resilience, which is a form of strength, and how to combat these symptoms of compassion fatigue and have what's an adaptive outcome rather than that burning. So caregiver resilience is a thing that's been studied, and it's defined as the ability to adapt well psychologically, emotionally, physically in the face of adversity and stress. So in spite of it, sometimes even beyond it. Here's this tree that's been beat up a lot. In fact, this is a picture of the oldest tree somewhere. I don't know where, I forget, Africa or something. And it's still living. And it's faced all kinds of storms, and it looks, maybe some would think weird. I think it looks awesome and much more interesting than just some regular old tree that's not had struggles. So this quote I like from Valiant is, a twig with a fresh green living core. When twisted out of shape, such a twig bends, but it does not break. Instead, it springs back and continues growing. So that's what we're going to aim for. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that little clip. I have watched it so many times now that it's actually a good thing that I can't hear it. But I really like it because it's got nothing to do with parenting, in particular the topic of it, but it does talk about this unique animal that was very proud and had talents and had abilities, and then he kind of gets stripped of those unexpectedly at no fault of his own, and he feels devastated and embarrassed and is scared to go out and see all the fans that he had, that people that admired him. But he gets help from that jackalope. Like, I don't know if there's any jackalopes around here, but I would like to get one to follow me around personally, because that jackalope talks to him about the powers of optimism and the powers of maybe revisiting your situation. Okay, here's your situation now. You've been stripped of your fur and you're all pink and weird looking. But if you aren't really thinking about that and you're thinking about these other things that you're really great at, then other people are going to pay attention to that too. And so he learns how to rebound and bounce and has a really great time. So that's kind of what we're moving into now. And this section is, in spite of being stripped of your fur, or having your fur, kind of ripped off here and there, or losing it, or it's fallen out, or whatever's happened to it, we can still go out there and we can still be resilient, and we can still enjoy a lot of our life as well as our child, and as well as those places that we have to engage. So I have a quote here from Albus Dumbledore, a very famous educator. A Patronus is a pure, protective, magical concentration of happiness and hope. And so what I'm hoping that we can generate in this room, Deborah will probably freak if it shows up, is our own Patronus. And in other words, identifying protective variables that are available to you. Something about the Patronus, and I just love Harry Potter and the books and the movies, is they're unique for each individual. So somebody has a stag, somebody else might have a hamster. It's what you need and depends on what's available to you and also what you individually need. And it may be very different from what somebody else has. And so, however, it is available to everybody if you know magic and if you really pay good attention to this workshop and apply some of these strategies. So we're going to come back to that slide that I showed you earlier of Bronfenbrenner. And this is this ecosystem again. The system of where we are interacting with our various meso and microsystems, etc. And now we're going to look at within and across those systems, not only are there sources of stress, but there are sources of protection. And so it may be, for example, that you have some individual characteristics of protection, such as being particularly persistent, let's say, not giving up easily, being able to manage your emotions. Maybe your child has some protective variables, as maybe they don't really notice so much when other kids are maybe not thinking that what they're doing is appropriate. And to some extent, that could be protective to them. But are there particular members of your family who are supportive? Maybe it's your aunt, who you can go to and they're actually supportive and you can spend more time with them. Maybe it's somebody within that school system. Or maybe you're having a really bad time in your particular school and you move to one that's so much more supportive. And that was my experience personally, of having a very terrible, unfulfilling and stressful experience in one school system and moving to another. And the psychiatrist I was working with at the time around my son said, either you're going to have to put him onto medication so that he can manage in that environment, or you're going to have to change the environment and get him in a different school. And although it was very difficult for me, because at that time I wasn't working, we were just living off one income, we pulled together the resources to send him to the school, and it made not only his life better, but mine. So, you know, you can see very big differences. It's not just school in general. It may be a school, a teacher, a support person. Okay, I'm going to just go over a couple of those factors. So one, which is actually the kind of the outer ring of where the macro system, the ideologies are, is social policy. So as we know, policies and ideologies are created by governments and agencies. But those governments and agencies are elected by us. So society influences policy. What we think as a society influences. Right now they're doing an election and people are spouting off, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Those aren't just their original ideas. They're hearing from people, we want to have this or we want to have that. So you can influence that policy and also that policy influence you. So something I'll say is vote. It's one thing to do. And also make your needs very clear, because those things filter down and they're very, very powerful in terms of what are the schools going to be like? Do they have a policy of full inclusion? Or do they have a policy of, we don't really know what to do with these kids, like they did in the 50s, and in fact they can't learn, which they used to think, and they shouldn't be here because they're going to corrupt everybody else, which honestly was the thinking at the time, to now, gee, there's a lot these kids can contribute, and if we teach them, they'll learn. So those policies are important. And your workplace. So in your workplace, that's one of those systems where you can look at it and think, gee, what is really necessary for me to do at work? What's doable? Do I have to spend, 18 hours creating this document, or could I spend less and it's good enough? For me personally, that's always been very difficult to do, but I know it's not an adaptive kind of behavior. Is there paternity and parental leave or paternity leave so that, maybe who's the highest earner can work and he or she who's the lower earner or more capable of staying at home can stay at home. Flexible hours, results focused versus presenteeism. Now that's a unique concept in this society, but it's the idea that you don't need to be there, say from 8 till 5 every single day, but you do need to produce 3 workshops by Friday. Having on-site support. So for those of you who are working in the school system, we have employee assistance programs that you can go to for counseling or support, and many families also have through their extended health, things like that. And just a note here for those of you who are caregiving professionals, because there's a lot about this in the professional compassion fatigue literature, is if you are a caregiving professional, so say an EA teacher or counselor, one of the on-site supports that's really important is having skilled debriefing and skilled support around things that are stressful. Say you're having difficulty managing or being effective with the child that you're working with, rather than venting. Because venting makes the situation worse, often enables a negative attitude, and makes the person much less compassionate. So I just want to put that word out there. If you're venting in the staff room, it's very counterproductive, not only unethical, but it will make you less competent. Similarly with parents, just venting isn't enough. There's a time to vent, but you need more than that. So in terms of all those systems, so remember those systems within the microsystem, so that you're accessing, so schools, hospitals, treatment centers. It's recommended through the literature on supporting families who have children with special needs or disabilities that these institutions take on a family-centered philosophy or approach. And Carl Dunst, who was my external supervisor for my dissertation, so Love him. I'd read all his literature as part of it, and I actually looked at the flip of stress and coping. I looked at empowerment, how to empower families who have children with special needs, and so he was my guru, and he ended up being my external supervisor. But his organization, Puckett.org, is a great one to look at, particularly if you are a professional and you're not familiar with what family-centered services are. But it's recommended that all of these services that support families or children, because children live in families, take on this approach. So what that means is welcoming, inviting, including, and engaging parents. When I first started working at Poppard, which was a while ago, and I just finished my dissertation, the approach at the time was that our consultants went into schools and they worked with the school team. That's who we're funded, and our mandate is to support the schools. And I was really surprised to see that in a lot of those consultations, the parents weren't there. They weren't invited. And so I asked about that. I said, I asked my supervisor and I asked other colleagues and I asked schools, where are the parents? And what I was repeatedly told is we work with the schools. We're helping the schools help the kids. And I was just shocked by that because it was so contrary to what the literature was on how to effectively support those children. Because if you go back to that system, those children live in families. And by supporting those families, we are supporting the children. And if we exclude the families and we don't bring them to the meetings and we don't include them and we don't invite their expertise, they are going to be disempowered, less able, less engaged, more critical of your system. So we've really worked to change that in Poppard, particularly where I work. So we'll make ways to welcome them, to include them, to support them. We look for family strengths. So not everybody's, perfect. And in fact, those of us who try to be perfect usually end up getting sick. So what is that family strength? Just like we would work with a child, and professionals tend to get this, teachers do get it. Well, where is this child's strengths? Even if they have a ton of challenges and they can identify them. So where is this family strength? Meeting the families where they're at. And so rather than thinking every family should totally have their act together, should have tons of resources, should be able to, make their child do the homework every night and make sure they're always here on time and do all those things that you hope they'll do, maybe they just can't for whatever reason. I worked in a school system as a district psychologist, and there was a child I was working with there, and they referred to me by the school because this child was often late or didn't come to school. And she was only in grade 2. So I started working with her. And something that the school didn't realize, the teachers didn't realize, the principal didn't realize, because they'd asked me to intervene with the family. When I connected with the family, it was very, very difficult to get a hold of, and finally did through numerous efforts. Single dad who had terminal cancer. Nobody knew this. Teachers didn't know it. He wasn't able to get out of bed in the morning very easily, in fact, with great difficulty, to get his child organized. This girl was such a resilient child. She fooled everybody. She came in, she was very bright, she did her work, she was very competent, but she often was late or wasn't there because dad was not physically, literally physically able to get her there. So we met them where they were, and when people realized that, we got things on board. We got a youth support worker to be able to go to the house to bring her to school, etc. So rather than assuming, there's the parent, they're just not getting her here, or there's this child, she doesn't want to come to school, meeting them where they're at. And recognizing families are experts on their child. They really are the experts. They know that child, they've lived with that child, but they're also following that child. So the more you can do as a professional, and I'm speaking here to these professionals, medical, family services, social workers, education, behavior analysts, all of you out there, the more you can support and include those families, the more you're going to build their strengths. And I don't just mean how to teach them to, do treatment. You are going to make them more powerful, more resilient, and they're going to support their child better. And we know it's huge from the literature, and I did this in my dissertation, looked at the outcomes, and when families are empowered, the child does better, without question, whether it's in a medical situation, whether it's in a school situation, regardless of situation. Even if all you did was support the family and you didn't deal with the child does better. So if your focus is, I'm just going to give this child medicine, or I'm just going to teach this child to read, and I'm not involving that family, really your treatment is not going to be very effective. It could be so much more powerful by involving and including that family. So I added this little slide. I'll send it to you just because I couldn't help myself. This was from my dissertation. That's me there, Robinson. And Dunstan Trevette, he actually took my dissertation and included it in this meta-analysis that he did on how to empower families. But this is from the research. So just a summary of it. When we employ family-centered care, when we include, involve, and respect families, families feel empowered, confident, and capable. So if you look at that caregiver satisfaction, very aligned. We increase the buy-in to treatment and education plans. So if you want to get these families on board, if you want them to do things differently at home, if you want them to, get their child to school on time, include them in that plan. Don't just tell them, and they're more likely to do it. And they're less likely to complain, right? So when their families are treated this way, hands down, when they're asked, what do you think about the school? What do you think about the hospital? They say, it's a great school. It's a great hospital. Even if the school or hospital isn't doing everything great for that child, if the kid isn't cured after the end of the month, they still feel better about it. And you're going to have a much more positive relationship between the family and between the school. There's better physical and mental health outcomes for the family, less depression, anxiety, anger, and improved developmental outcomes for children. Now, something I do want to note for the educators out there, and when I did my dissertation, I came across this, and it didn't really surprise me because I'd had training as a teacher, and I'd done my master's degree in school psychology, and then I was doing my doctoral degree. And not until I started working on my dissertation on this topic did I even know what this family-centered behavior was, because educators generally receive no training on how to support families, period, or how to support families who have children with disabilities. It's within the professional curriculums, typically for social workers, for physicians, for nurses, for various professions, but it's missing from most education programs. So it's not school professionals' fault if they don't know why to do it or how to do it, because they haven't learned it. But another note that I want to give you to the educators as well as to the families is schools right now in BC are all into this trauma-informed schools. We're trauma-informed. You may hear that. We're really into this. Well, ask them what they mean by trauma-informed, and you will find that most of those concepts completely overlap with family-centered, because it's about forming caring, compassionate, connected, sensitive communities. And so that is something for you to kind of put in the back of your hat if you're getting flack from schools. Well, we can't really include you in this, but we're really into trauma. Ask about that and ask what they mean by it, because it does mean involving, including, and supporting that whole context around the child.